So 28 Years Later is the third installment in the 28 Days Later franchise. Of course, with 28 days later, 28 weeks, and now 28 years, it is the return of Danny Boyle as director and writer Alex Garland to return to the big screen, to return to this incredible franchise, an incredible universe, in my opinion, to explore the land of the undead and how they've evolved over the 28 years that have passed since 28 weeks. And I gotta admit, this film is very, very divisive, and a lot more divisive than I would have thought, and that is purely down to the choices made, specifically the last 5 minutes of this movie, which again, in my opinion, I also agree with. Very divisive, very weird, very interesting, but also underlying everything, a little bit disturbing. But anyways, let me know what you thought of 28 Years Later in the comments below. Without further ado, I'm going to skate into my review. If you have anything to do with horror films, make sure to smash the like button down below. Make sure to subscribe as well to keep up to date whenever we upload. And without further ado, let's get straight into the review. So, this film stars Ralph Fiennes, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Jodie Comer in the newest installment in the 28 Days franchise. And I gotta admit, this film is very, very interesting. I thought it was really, really masterful in my opinion. I absolutely loved it. However, I did have some issues with this film, specifically with the writing, actually. Because I feel, and I'm very confident on this, that this almost feels like two films drawn into one. We have a generic coming-of-age film in the first 25 minutes or so with Aaron Taylor Johnson and his younger son, who's Spike, of course, the main character and protagonist in this film. And I gotta be honest, this part of the film was interesting, but then again, it felt fairly generic, fairly everything of like a young boy trying to become a man with his dad who's very, very pushy and demanding of him. We've seen that multiple times. However, around the halfway point of this film, we get this switch. To me, this is the Oscar-worthy Alex Garland writing that we've seen that ends up being in majority of this film. I think after the 30-minute mark is when this film slowly starts to kick into gear, specifically when Jodie Comer becomes at the forefront of this film. Because I gotta be honest, there's parts of this film that really feel drawn out, but when it comes to this section of the film, specifically maybe like the last 3/4 of it, I gotta be honest, I absolutely adored it. However, Aaron Taylor Johnson character was very, very interesting to me. I do think he will show up in a different role further on in the series. In my opinion, I feel like he's going to become an alpha. Just saying. If you look at the trailer, there's very, very interesting thoughts on that, and especially in the film. If you've seen how he acts, it's very, very anger fueled, in my opinion. But when it comes to this film, I think Aaron Taylor Johnson kind of disappearing off the face of the earth of this film was an interesting choice. However, let's be real, he's going to be a big part of the second film. But I think it's enough said that the fact that this film is interesting, it's cool, but in my opinion, the way they use the infected in this film is really cool. And I really like the new evolutions of these infected. We have these slow ones that kind of live on the ground. They're still obviously dangerous, of course. We have the typical runners, and obviously we have these alphas. Now, the alphas are very, very cool in my opinion. They really do remind me of a specific 80s slasher film with another actor. If you've seen the film, you know exactly what I mean by that film. But in my opinion, I think these alphas are really interesting, and I feel like they're going to be a huge part of the second film as well when it comes to the Bone Temple that comes out in January. And I do admit, I do think that the ending of this film really hinders the film, because I think when it comes to 28 Years Later, I think a lot of films in general, that last 5-10 minutes, the last act is what the film leaves you with. The feeling of everything that's culmination to this ending, and you're kind of sitting there in 28 Years Later, more confused, if anything. Because all of a sudden, we have Spike in this really cool scene, in my opinion. This really cool ending scene. Really intense, really amplified by the music, of course. Like a typical 28 installment would be. But in my opinion, I do find it interesting the fact that how they turn this into almost like a Power Rangers type montage almost. And I gotta be honest, it took me out of the film. It really, really did. And regardless of what it means for the future of the series, I understand obviously it has this overlying meaning. It wouldn't be in the film otherwise. But it really diminishes 28 Years Later to me. I think that the fact of how this scene is meant to, you know, kind of lead into the second film. Of course it is. But the fact that that's the whole point of it probably being there, this kid from the start coming back 28 years later, in my opinion, it's a little bit hindered by the fact of why would you do it now? I mean, I'd rather you just kind of, you know, leave it, not have the whole Power Rangers action scene, just kind of show the character, say hi, and then cut to black. That's how I would have done it. But this whole Power Rangers type scene really takes you out of the film. It makes you feel like you're watching a completely different movie, in my opinion. And it really hinders the first film. And that's the complete and God honest truth. I think that this film suffers from hoping that this scene can make everyone hyped enough for the second film. But in reality, it actually made people more divisive about the film. I have not seen a single review on 28 Years Later that has not brought up these last 5 minutes or so being confusing or them not liking it. I haven't seen many people say they enjoy this scene or make sense of it all. I mean, obviously in the future it's going to make sense. I mean, it's a load of Jimmy Savile kind of groups, which is another weird thing in my opinion. But I think that in general, to have this sort of scene really takes you out of the whole intenseness of it. I mean, you have Spike running away from these really intense scenes, and all of a sudden it's like we're going into this kind of like action B movie type thing. Very, very interesting choice, if you ask me. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore the film. I think Ralph Fiennes is obviously excellent, which we'll go on to now. But in my opinion, this ending scene really took me out of it, and it gave me this really confusing feeling by the end. And I gotta be honest, I would have rather it just not been there at all. However, of course, when we go on to the second film that's coming out in January called The Bone Temple, directed by Nia DaCosta, which I'm so happy that she's directing because she's an excellent director. However, we have, assuming, more emphasis on Ralph Fiennes' character. And Ralph Fiennes plays this doctor character in the film, and I gotta be honest, I really love him as an actor. How he has not won an Oscar yet, I will never understand. But to be honest, when it comes to Ralph Fiennes being this kind of bone doctor, it's really, really interesting because I think his story and how he implements his own arc into everything, how he was just a misunderstood person by specifically Aaron Taylor Johnson, is a really nice touch. And I've got to be honest, this whole Bone Temple scene, if you've seen the film, you know exactly what scene I'm about to talk about, with Spike climbing on top of the Bone Temple. It's a beautiful scene. It's a tragic and beautiful and really heart-wrenching scene and gut-wrenching scene, if you ask me. I think it's an incredible scene, and it almost had me to tears, and that's what really brought me into the film, was the fact of, wow, okay, this film really turned from a generic kind of apocalypse movie and coming of age story into a coming of age story still, but in a more cinematic and masterful way, which is a really big plus for me. But then obviously that last 5 minutes kind of took that a little bit away from it. But when it comes to 28 Years Later, you get this vibe of two separate scripts, but in my opinion, the way they merge together is, yes, weird, but it's for the better. I wouldn't have wanted to stay in that kind of vibe like the original 20 minutes were. I would have much preferred how the film took place, how it kind of developed into this more cinematic and more, honestly, more of a masterpiece, if you ask me. I'm not going to call this film a masterpiece because it's not, but there definitely is a completely separate filming technique when it comes to this second act of the film and third act, of course. But there's also another thing we do have to mention about the filming, is the fact that this film was all shot on iPhone 15s, which is crazy to me. In terms of this kind of rig, kind of this like circular, semicircle rig that goes around the infected in this photo, I think it's cool, but in the film, I don't think it's practical. I think the way they've done the kill scenes in this film, in terms of killing the infected, I don't like it. I really don't. I think it kind of turns it into like a video game, like the 2000s, and it really kind of takes you out of the vibe. It's a really intense scene. All of a sudden, it has to take this whole different camera angle just to show you, oh yeah, it went through his head, guys. Just know that. Not really necessary in my opinion. Obviously it's a cool idea, but in practice, I think it could have been a little bit better implemented, in my opinion. However, I do think it's interesting to the fact that the gore in this film is fantastic, specifically with the alphas. They kind of carry the gore of this film. There was some confusing parts in this film when it comes to the kind of like dream sequences, but ultimately this film is still fantastic. I still really, really enjoyed it. I had an absolute blast of a time. I'm very, very much looking forward to the Bone Temple in January. However, I kind of want to see a bit more substance to that ending at 28 Years Later, because I'll be honest, really didn't like that ending, just the honest truth. However, that is my overall opinion and review on 28 Years Later. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. What did you think of that ending? Did it confuse you? Did it kind of go, oh, okay, whatever? Did it take you out of that experience? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And of course, as I said in the beginning, if you like anything to do with horror films, make sure to smash the like button down below. Make sure to subscribe as well, because this is the home of horror reviews. I make my own horror films as well. So if you want to go check out some original horror scripts, you can go check out my 2 short films that are linked in the very top of the description or in the featured tab on my channel. But thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate you all tuning in, and thank you so much. And I shall see you in the next one. And of course, stay safe and peace. First shot of this episode, Tammy picks this house.
Oh, what about that one?
Now, if you ask me, that is the, worst house you can pick. It has wallpaper on